The topic at hand is the Middle East, past, present, and future. And I thought that I would start with the most interesting part. So that would be the present. What on earth is happening right now? You probably know that there is increasing unrest revolving around the Temple Mount. And there's tremendous controversy over the last few days over the killing of an Al Jazeera reporter, Shireen Abu Akleh. So the Temple Mount first. The Temple Mount is an extraordinary place because, well, for very many reasons, but because not many people realize the massive concessions that Israel made after 1967, when the Jordanian occupation was ended and Israel took possession of the area. It did not say, well, now anybody can go up to the Temple Mount. Jews can only go for 4 hours each day, and only if they do not, and cannot pray. While they're there, even mouthing silent prayers will get you stopped by the Israeli police and escorted out of the area. Muslims, on the other hand, can go up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock at any time without any restrictions and pray all they want. Now, this is an extraordinary concession in light of the fact that Israel is universally portrayed as the oppressor and as perpetrating terrible things against the Palestinians. And in this case, they have given these massive concessions to the Palestinians and restricted the Israeli people themselves, Israeli Jews, from being able to go to the holiest site in Judaism. Now, this is not a holy site in Islam, although it is widely assumed to be and reported to be. It is only a holy site in Islam because it's a holy site in Judaism. And the one depends upon the other. So that the recent unrest comes from the fact that there was a group that wanted to sacrifice a calf on the Temple Mount. But the group was barred from entering the area, and the leader of the group was barred even from entering Jerusalem itself, barred by the Israeli government. So there was never a question of there being any sacrifice on the Temple Mount. However, there are ongoing claims and rumors on the part of the Palestinian Arabs that the Jews plan to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to make it into a synagogue, to Judaize Jerusalem, which is sort of a silly thing to say since, of course, Jerusalem is the quintessential city of the Jews. Nonetheless, this is the kind of thing that circulates among the Palestinians. And they get so angry about this that there is increasing violence, and there may be much more in the near future, over just these rumors. Now, what's strange about this is that the only reason why this matters so much to them is precisely because the whole purpose of the Muslim presence on the Temple Mount is to show the superiority and victory of Islam over the Jews. That is the only reason, the sole reason, the absolutely number one, beginning to end reason why they are there. Because obviously this was the site of the Jewish temple, the first temple, the second temple. There's never been another place where there was the Jewish temple. That's it. So when the Arabs conquered Jerusalem in the late 630s, 60 years later, they built the dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the site of the temple in order to show that they had defeated Judaism, that Islam was superior to Judaism, and here was their mosque to prove that victory. And they named it Al-Aqsa, which means the farthest mosque. Why did they name it the farthest mosque? Well, it happens to be in the Quran. The Quran never mentions Jerusalem, not once. So if you think about the Hebrew scriptures and the hundreds of times Jerusalem is mentioned, and there's nothing in the Quran about Jerusalem. It's an extraordinary difference and a clear indication that this is a holy site for the Jews, but not for Islam. The only thing that is taken as a mention of Jerusalem in the Quran is chapter 17, verse 1, which says, "May he be glorified who carried his servant by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, around which we have blessed, so that we might show him some of our signs. Indeed, he, only he, is the hearer, the seer." That's it. Now, the idea, the claim of Islam to Jerusalem rests on the conflation of this farthest mosque, that is Masjid Al-Aqsa, with the structure on the Temple Mount that is called Masjid Al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque. However, there is absolutely no connection between the two in any genuine historical sense. Because in the first place, this book, the Quran, available now, is supposedly the record of the revelations that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, received between the years 610 and 632. So the whole thing was supposedly finished by the year 632. And then collected together when people who had memorized pieces of it started dying off, and they were afraid that we would lose it, and what a terrible loss that would have been for the world. And consequently, in the year 653, the Caliph Uthman, the leader of all the Muslims and successor of Muhammad, gathered together all the Qurra, the people who had memorized parts of the Quran, got them to recite what they memorized, gathered it all together, burned the variants, and distributed the single unified Quran to all the Islamic provinces. This is the story. If the story is remotely true, which is highly in doubt for a number of reasons, if it is true, however, then that means that the Quran was completed decades before the Al-Aqsa Mosque was actually built. Such that when Muhammad supposedly was taken, as the passage says, that he was taken from the sacred mosque, which is in Mecca, to the farthest mosque, Al-Aqsa, there was no Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The farthest mosque must therefore have been some other thing. The alternative explanation, which I think is actually more historically accurate, is that Muhammad didn't write the Quran, that there may never have been a figure who corresponds to the Prophet of Islam. There may have been a Muhammad, but he's nothing like this guy that we hear so much about in 9th century stories that date from 200 years after he's supposed to have lived. But then this book, the Quran, started to be put together in the 7th century, in the beginning of the 8th century, and consequently they do refer to the Al-Aqsa Mosque as Jerusalem, but then it has nothing to do with any actual journey of the Prophet of Islam there, because there was no Prophet of Islam. Either way, in other words, it doesn't work. And there is absolutely no genuine claim on the part of any actual Islamic text to Jerusalem. However, it is true that in those 9th century Islamic traditions that purport to give the circumstances of revelation for the Quran, they tell a big story about how Muhammad was awakened in the middle of the night and taken on a winged white horse with a human head named Burak, not Barack Obama, but Burak, and carried on this horse to Jerusalem, where from the Temple Mount he ascended into the various levels of paradise, met all the prophets, including Moses, who greeted him as a brother prophet, met Allah himself, who told him to get his followers to pray 50 times a day. And then he came out and told Moses, he said we should pray 50 times a day, and Moses said, that's too many. Go and bargain him down. And they finally Muhammad bargains Allah down to 5 prayers a day, which is still the practice in Islam to this day. But all this is a story that has no historical value because there's no trace of it from before around the 830s, which is 200 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died. So while the Islamic traditions are very clear in mentioning Jerusalem, and do mention it frequently, they come so much later as to vitiate any historical value that they might have had. So, why was the Al-Aqsa Mosque built? It was not built in connection with these stories. It was built in order to assert the supremacy of Islam. And that was it. So when these rumors go around nowadays that the Jews are going to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or they're going to Judaize it, they're going to make it a synagogue, this strikes at the very heart of the whole purpose of the mosque itself. And the whole purpose of the Muslim presence on the Temple Mount. This is not a unique thing. This is something that the Muslims have done all over the world. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was the grandest church in the Christian world for 1,000 years. It was built in 537. 900 years, okay. 916. Because on Tuesday, May 29th, 1453, it was conquered. Constantinople was entered by the Ottoman Muslim Turkish armies. And Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque. In this case, it was not demolished. It was transformed, and it's a mosque now. It was a museum for a while in the 20th century, but Recep Tayyip Erdogan made it a mosque again in 2020. That is designed to show that Islam is superior to Christianity and has defeated Christianity, because the Hagia Sophia was greater than anything in Rome. It was greater than anything anywhere else. It was the biggest, the grandest church. So to make it into a mosque shows we won, you lost, we're better, Allah is with us. Very simple concept, but this is we're not dealing on a very high level here. Now, it's also the same in India. And in the book, The History of Jihad, you can see the terrible story of the jihad against India. And unlike the Jews and Christians, the Hindus are not designated people of the book in the Quran. And they're not considered to have a valid revelation from Allah. So consequently, they are to be treated even more harshly than the Jews and Christians, in the sense that the Jews and Christians are given three choices: to convert to Islam, to submit and pay the tax, and accept various discriminatory and humiliating regulations that are designed to rub it in, you see, that you lost, you're defeated, and our prophet has conquered and is supreme, and you have to show your submission to the Muslims and every day be reminded that they are victorious and you were defeated. That's the whole idea of that, but that's not even offered in Islamic law, although it was offered by way of accommodation, because they found out, there are a lot of Hindus, we can't really kill them all. So it was offered later, but primarily the idea is convert to Islam or be killed. So all through India, they acted with extraordinary harshness, even more than in Europe or anywhere else. And in India, it was routine practice to destroy Hindu temples, to destroy the idols that were in the Hindu temples, to take the broken pieces and put them in the walkway on the way into the mosque. Seems to me this would make for a bit of a difficult walk, but that's their business. So that the Muslims would be trampling on the Hindu gods as they entered the mosque. This was done again and again all over India for centuries. And even now there are controversies now in India where Hindus are saying that this famous mosque or that famous mosque, even the Taj Mahal, was built on top of a Hindu temple, and asking that there be investigations, even excavations, or various kinds of inquiries to try to determine whether or not that's the case. But there are certainly many already abundantly documented instances where mosques were built on the site of destroyed Hindu temples. Why? Same reason, to show that Islam is superior to Hinduism and has defeated it. Why are the idols broken up and the pieces put on the way to the mosque? Same reason. Their gods are defeated and destroyed, and Allah is supreme. So, Al-Aqsa and the whole Temple Mount has never mattered to Islam except when it mattered to Judaism. And so, you take, for example, the Dome of the Rock. You know, if you've been up there during those 4 hours that non-Muslims are allowed up there, then you may have noticed there's not one but two mosques on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. Both date from the late 7th century, the last decade of the 7th century. But the Dome of the Rock is the one that dominates the landscape. Al-Aqsa is really actually kind of nondescript. But the Dome of the Rock is the one you see. All postcard of Jerusalem, the big golden dome, it dominates everything, right? Now, if we were able to go back 100 years, that would not be the case. The Dome of the Rock was there, but the golden dome was not. What happened was this: Zionism. And Jews started to come from all over the world. There was always a Jewish presence in what is now Israel, the modern state. There were Jews who never left. And this is something that's not recognized very much today. You can get details of it in the Palestinian Delusion, which is available now. But the fact is that there were always Jews in that area. And they were always a presence. But of course, there was a sharp influx after Theodor Herzl began to gather steam with the Zionist movement. And settlers were coming from all over and buying land and increasing the Jewish population in that area. And this was intolerable to the Muslims for a number of reasons that we will get into. But one of the responses that is very little known nowadays that was done was that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a man you may have heard of, Haj Amin al-Husseini, in the 1920s took up a collection to gild the dome of the Rock. And he collected a considerable sum of money and made that very bright golden dome that we see now in all the postcards. Before that, it was a pretty dingy building. And I believe it's Mark Twain even mentions it, that in his discussions of walking around in Jerusalem, and when he's saying, you know, this is a desolate area, and there's nobody around, and there are these dingy mosques and on the Temple Mount, and everything looks run down, and weeds growing up, and all this. It's because the Jewish presence was not considered to be a threat. But when the Jewish population began to increase, then suddenly the Temple Mount becomes massively important. Because once again, they think we have to reassert our supremacy here. We have to remind these people that we're victorious. We have to show them that we conquered and that Allah is supreme. So the dome gets gilded. And suddenly it becomes of cardinal importance and a massively great holy site. Actually, you know that there are prayers every day, 5 times a day, as I noted, in Islam, and there's just no focus on Jerusalem. They pray facing Mecca wherever they are in the world. Mecca is the holy city. The Kaaba is there. There are various legends about actually Abraham himself going there and building the Kaaba. And a great deal of elaboration of the importance of those areas, but nothing in regard to Jerusalem. Only this declaration of supremacy. And so this is why there's this controversy now. Meanwhile, of course, there's also all the deception. And so we see this with this controversy just in the last few days over the unfortunate killing of this Al Jazeera reporter, Shireen Abu Akleh. And it seems that she was shot in a time when there was this crossfire and some people were firing indiscriminately. And of course, Ilhan Omar, the representative from Minnesota, has immediately blamed the IDF. Many, many entities around the world are reflexively blaming Israel for this. But the Israelis, meanwhile, have gone to the Palestinians and said, we could inspect the bullet that killed this lady, and that would make it very clear who was responsible. But the Palestinians refused to allow this, even though the Israelis said, we can have a Palestinian representative there, and an Israeli representative there, and the reporters there, so that it's all public, it's all transparent, no chicanery. They won't do it. You gotta wonder, what is it that there is to hide? But deception is also at the heart of the whole Palestinian enterprise. Obviously, the invention of the Palestinian nationality itself is the quintessential example of how this whole edifice is built on lies. You know, when I was researching this Palestinian delusion, I noticed that it's really kind of glaring. You go back into any of the literature before the 1960s, and there are no Palestinians. And it's the Israeli-Arab conflict. And even when the United Nations was trying to carve out 2 states in 1948-49, it's an Arab state. Nobody ever says the Palestinians are this people, this is the indigenous people of the area, and they have to have a state. And all this is based also on Islamic imperatives. The Quran, once again, chapter 3, verse 28, says, do not, well, let me get it here. Let not the believers take unbelievers for their friends in preference to believers. Whoever does that has no connection with Allah, unless you are guarding yourselves against them, taking security. So what does that mean? Unless you are guarding yourselves against them, you should not make friends with unbelievers. If you're a Muslim, you should not have any non-Muslim friends. This is what the Quran says. You might have a wonderful friend who's a Muslim. I'm not talking about him. He might not be reading this, but this is what the Quran says. Let not the believers take unbelievers for their friends in preference to believers. Whoever does this has no connection with Allah unless you're guarding yourselves against them. Now, unless you're guarding yourselves against them means, according to the Islamic commentators, the Islamic scholars that are considered authoritative, that I have here in the footnotes for this passage, one of them says, we smile in the face of some people, although our hearts curse them. And another one says, if you, the Muslims that is, are under the infidels' authority, fearing for yourselves, behave loyally to them with your tongue, while harboring inner animosity for them. Allah has forbidden believers from being friendly or on intimate terms with the infidels in place of believers, except when the infidels are above them in authority. In such a scenario, let them act friendly toward them. So this is an explicit allowance for deception. The deception does not only take the form of appearing friendly when you're not friendly, which is what those passages were about, but also of any deception that is liable to advance the cause of Islam. Consequently, if this reporter was killed by the Palestinians, as seems to be the case because they were the ones firing indiscriminately while the IDF was firing at very specific targets and she was not one of them, then it is entirely within their interests and also in service of religious imperatives within Islam for them to lie to the entire world to try to demonize Israel in this way. And this deception, in other words, is not just a tactical matter, it's a holy act. Because this is commanded in Allah's book. And consequently, it's not something that you do reluctantly, or that you do half-heartedly, or that you don't follow through upon, or that you harbor the truth in your heart. You wholeheartedly embrace the lie, the deception. Because this is the imperative that you have from Allah. You were doing it to guard yourselves against them taking security, as the passage in the Quran says. And this, of course, ultimately is also the reason why all the peace processes have failed and why they always will fail. The American government never gets this. The American government has no interest in Islam. And that's fine. The American government is not a theological society. It's not a religious group. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion and all that. So I don't care if the American government doesn't know anything about Islam. However, when one party in a dispute in which the American government has involved itself is insisting that Islam has everything to do with what they're doing, then it is foolish in the extreme for the American government and other governments as well to ignore that. And yet that's the situation. If you listen to Mahmoud Abbas, if you listen to Ismail Haniyeh, if you listen to all of the various Palestinian leaders, they always talk about Islam. Always. And they always situate what they're doing within Islam. And yet, then you read the Camp David Accords or Oslo or any of the others, and Islam never exists. It's never mentioned. Now, this is a catastrophic analytical failure that leads to blind alleys and errors of policy. The particular problem that dooms all the peace processes is a very simple statement in chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran. Drive them out from where they drove you out. Drive them out from where they drove you out. Now, once again, you have to understand, this is not some book you read. It's the word, the perfect and eternal words of Allah that existed forever with Allah in paradise. There are three eternal things in Islam. Allah is thrown in his book. And then the book is sent down piecemeal to Muhammad and transmitted in perfect form as the Quran. So when it says drive them out from where they drove you out, that also is a holy act like the deception. You have a responsibility before Allah to drive out those who drove you out. Now, in the Palestinian delusion, I show that nobody was driven out, that numerous Arab leaders actually called for the Arabs to leave when the state of Israel declared its independence in 1948. Numerous Arabs told them to go so that they would not be in the line of fire when the five Arab states that had declared war on Israel destroyed it. They wouldn't be in the way, they wouldn't be harmed, and then as soon as the Jewish state is gone, then they can come back. Well, it didn't quite work out. But nonetheless, this is the mythology. And here again, it doesn't even matter if it's based on a lie, because lying is also a holy act. So you were driven out, you have to drive them out. There's no negotiating that away. There is no way that you can say, well, we were going to drive them out, but now we went to Oslo and we made a deal. And so we're not going to drive them out anymore. We're going to live side by side in peace and harmony as the great Abrahamic faiths. This is not how the Quran even understands the Abrahamic faiths. You know, if you go to chapter 60, verse 4, very important passage, as I'm sure you're aware, when you're reading your Quran, you probably have highlighted this. Chapter 60, verse 4 says, there is an excellent example for you in Abraham. Now, isn't that nice? You know, we're all Abrahamic faiths here. So there's an excellent example for you in Abraham and those with him. So there's a particular situation in which Abraham is an excellent example, okay? Here it is. You ready? When they told their people, indeed, we are guiltless of you and all that you worship besides Allah. That is, you're guilty, we're not. We have done with you. And there has arisen between us and you hostility and hatred forever, until you believe in Allah alone. That's Abraham in the Quran. It even goes on, it even gets worse. Except what Abraham promised his father, I will ask forgiveness for you. So did you catch that? There's an excellent example for you in Abraham when he says hostility and hatred forever between us and the non-Muslims. But Abraham is not an excellent example when he says to his father, I'll ask forgiveness for you. So don't ask forgiveness for those unbelievers, just hate them. And once again, I must emphasize, if you think that this is a book that's written by the only divine being, then these things are not negotiable. And consequently, every last negotiated agreement is foredoomed to fail. And every one that they conclude next year or in 5 years or 10 years is doomed to fail. There is absolutely no doubt about this. As long as there are people who believe the Quran is the book of Allah, and that Allah is real and Muhammad was real, there's never going to be a negotiated settlement. So why do they even enter into them? Because they know that it's a good way to get concessions from the Israelis. Because the Americans constantly, and you can see this in the history of the peace process and the Palestinian delusion, press the Israelis for concessions. It goes all the way back. Camp David is the most notorious example, but by no means the only one. Jimmy Carter was enthralled with Sadat. It was practically hero worship. But Sadat was not the great peacemaker you may have heard of. Sadat was only there because the Soviets had pulled the rug out from under him. I have a marvelous phone call here, not phone call, I have the minutes of the Politburo meeting where Brezhnev says, we're going to guarantee Israel's borders. And this is the 70s, and the Soviet Union was dead set against Israel. And Gromyko, the foreign minister, is shocked, and he says, you know, the Arabs, they're going to get upset. And Brezhnev says, they can go to hell. We have offered them a sensible way for so many years, but no, they wanted to fight. Fine. We gave them technology, the latest, the kind even Vietnam didn't have. They had double superiority in tanks and aircraft, triple in artillery, and in air defense and anti-tank weapons, they had absolute supremacy. And what? Once again, they were beaten. Once again, they scrammed. Once again, they screamed for us to come and help them. Sadat woke me up in the middle of the night twice over the phone, save me. He demanded we send Soviet troops. And immediately, no, we are not going to fight for them. The people would not understand that. And especially, we will not start a world war because of them. So that's that. That's Brezhnev. So what could Sadat do? He couldn't get another war against Israel. This was after the 73 war. So he became the great peacemaker. He turned to the United States. He told them he wanted to make peace. He went and addressed the Knesset. And lo and behold, he got the Sinai back. It worked like a charm. The Americans, Carter thought he was another Gandhi and pressed Begin to make concessions. And what could Begin do? It was 2 against 1, and it was the United States. So he made concessions. The American government has always pressed Israel to make concessions, and never the Palestinians. Donald Trump was the first president to say, wait a minute, We're giving you money and you're giving it to terrorists? Well, you're not getting any more money then. It seems like common sense. But the first thing Biden did when he came in was turn the money flow back on. And he says you can't have the settlements in Judea and Samaria and so on. Well, legally, this is land that was given by the League of Nations after the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the British to form a Jewish national home. There is no other country that has a legal claim on it. So when people say this is occupied territory, who's occupied from who? There was never a Palestinian state. It's not Jordan's land. It's not Egypt's land. It's the Ottoman Empire's dead. Whose is it? It's Israel's. As per the only prevailing international legal agreements. But nobody seems to care. And it's kind of like, when you have a dysfunctional family and there's an entirely unreasonable sibling and a reasonable sibling, and then the third sibling or the parent says to the reasonable sibling, you really should give him what he wants, because they know they can talk to him. They know they can reason with him. They can't deal with the other one. He's crazy. And it's a lot like that. But the Israeli government is unfortunately aiding in this, in accepting it and acting as if there could be some agreement that would ultimately solve this problem. This is not a problem that can be solved. It's a problem that can only be managed. And that means it can be held at bay. And it can be held at bay indefinitely. The jihad, actually, according to Islamic law, is not to be pursued when the enemy has more than twice your strength. And so if the Israelis were overwhelmingly strong and had support, now I know I'm speaking in a very simple way because there's so many impediments to that and so many difficulties. But if you really want to talk about the future in the Middle East and how to attain peace, that's the only way. So I will end there, and thank you very much. If you have questions or comments or fatwas or whatever, we can go from there.